So you mentioned, I'm just curious, you mentioned on the way over here, your brother works for Elon Musk. So I'm just like, so you're one of the smartest people I know in this space. He works for Elon Musk. Like, what happened? What was your family doing? You guys just like, you're all just genius?
Oh no, man. We always joke that he was the one that got the brains and I got the brawn. Imagine the opposite of me in a person, like physically speaking.
Yeah.
That's him. So he's a very scrawny guy. Used to wear glasses, but he's just so incredibly smart. And I was always the athlete in the family, and he was the smart one. But
you're listening to the PJF Podcast, a show dedicated to decoding elite sports performance and fitness. I'm Paul Fabritz, and I'm an MBA strength and conditioning and performance trainer. If you want to become superhuman, take your fitness, and take your sports performance to the next level, this is the podcast for you. Let's do it.
All right, guys, so we got special guest in the building today, Conor Harris. Thanks for being here. Conor does some awesome work. If you're not already following him on social media, you should. We flew him out here because he's helping collaborate on a program that we're working on, because he is a very brilliant mind in a lot of the areas that I'm not great with. And so he's a great complement for our training. And so we got him here. We're going to do a quick podcast. Give us a quick intro on, who you are and how you got into the industry.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me, man. Like, it's honestly a privilege and an honor to be here and to work with you. And it's been such a good partnership so far. And I've really enjoyed just getting to know you. And honestly, like, I think the program we're making is going to be just unlike anything else. So I'm excited to put it together.
Yep.
But as for me, I got started off just trying to be a strength and conditioning coach. I wanted to work with the highest level athletes, just like most people do when they start off. Most people want to work with the best, and I did too. So my career path early on was to become a collegiate strength and conditioning coach, hopefully work my way into the pros and like that kind of sort of transition that most people look for. But as I started to get deeper into my career, I was doing some internships, and ironically enough, the first internship I ever did that was not in a pure strength and conditioning setting, more so just like in a sort of private gym, I had a deadlifting injury from ego deadlifting. And I was just deadlifting, felt a pop in my back, and I knew something was wrong because it felt like a pop and it was sharp. It felt like, honestly, like what I thought at the time, a disc herniation. And what ended up happening was just the pain persisted. I kept doing like these traditional rehab drills. And it just felt good for a little bit, but it wasn't sticking. And I thought, this can't be right. Why do I keep doing this? And I keep doing the proper rehab, but I don't feel better long term. I'll feel better in the short term, maybe a couple minutes, an hour or two, but just didn't stick. So it just kept happening again and again. And every time I felt like I felt good, I would go deadlift again, back pain. And then during this internship, someone told me, everything that you've learned about the back and rehab, I just don't agree with a lot of it, which really took me off guard at first. I was like, that doesn't sound right.
Yeah, because when you're young, like going through college, you assume that people have it figured out.
Yeah.
They're giving you this information. And you're like, you're giving me this because you're right about it. And then at some point you realize like, oh, we could actually challenge what's currently right. And this thing is all going to change.
Yeah. And just to like have the open-mindedness to accept that and be like, okay, maybe what I've learned and what I've learned from people I respect a lot, maybe I don't have to be married to those ideas all the time, 100%. So it was honestly, it took me a good month or two to like really buy into what this guy was telling me. His name's Aaron Haig. He's over in Portland. Resilient Human Performance. Honestly, one of the most profound influences in my career so far. And I started to do these drills, and they were kind of weird. And they involved breathing and just like things I didn't think mattered that much. And eventually my back started feeling really good. And I was like, okay, I've been here before. I'm just going to go try deadlifting. Now I'm going to go try like doing some, agility, some running, stuff like that. And I felt really good. And I was like, oh, okay. So I thought there was something to this. There's something to this that wasn't like the other drills I had done before, the other rehabilitation protocols I had been a part of. So I'm, fast forward a couple months, a couple more internships, and I'm working with higher level athletes again. And I had an opportunity to take a couple of different jobs, but my heart wasn't fully in it anymore because I was just drawn to this other sort of viewpoint, this other perspective, this other type of training and methodology. The methodology I was working with was Postural Restoration Institute, PRI is what it's very much known as within our industry. And so I was like, well, I could go and try and be a strength coach, which is what I started out to do, or I can go and pursue this thing that's like pulling me and I'm really interested in because it helped me feel really good. And I feel like this is where I could make an impact on people. So I actually started to send out emails to every single PRI clinic in the entire country. And I was like, hey, do you need anyone? This is what I'm trying to do. And it really worked out in my favor because one of the ones that got back to me just happened to be looking for a strength coach, but also someone to work in the clinic and learn underneath everyone else. And so I was like, yep, this sounds great. Packed up my bags, moved to North Carolina, where I worked with a PRI clinic and people who actually teach the methodology in the real courses. And so I learned underneath them, Jen and Chris Poulin, who have been the best mentors for me that I could have ever asked for. And I learned under them for a good bit of time, about a year and a half. And then I moved back to Oregon to open up my gym, my own facility. But then COVID happened as soon as I got back. So I didn't really have much of an opportunity to do that. But I've been able to transition and use these techniques online and get experience working with anyone from general population to MLB athletes to high-level powerlifters to basketball players. Like I've been with a lot of different populations. And what's interesting is the human body is the human body. Like just because you're a basketball player or I'm a powerlifter or I'm just someone working at a desk job, you still have 4 limbs. You still have a heart on the left side. You still have a liver on the right side. You still have a diaphragm that's asymmetrical, and that has influences on what the rest of your body is capable of doing. And if we can agree on that we have that fundamental asymmetry, then we know that the body is asymmetrical, and there's different things that are going to be influenced by that asymmetry. And so I think we can take this lens and start to understand human movement through it. And so what I've done is use it with a lot of different populations. And I've seen some good results with some people. And I think it's really helped me use this as a teaching tool to help other coaches because I'm so passionate about it. And I really do think it works a lot better than a lot of these other things out there. I don't think it's the only thing that should be used, but I think it is a good lens to look through human movement and strength and conditioning and getting higher levels of athletic performance.
Right. 100%. So for a little bit of background, I started diving into PRI stuff last year. I've heard about it forever, but I never got past that initial idea of like, hey, we're just asymmetrical. And so I started diving into it. I started doing, especially with our force plate testing and now with our pressure mapping, you consistently see that people are just heavier on the right side. Yeah. You get a full foot contact on the right side, but then on the left side, it's like they're barely on the floor. Yeah. And then you start to really see it up close and personal. And you're like, this is correct. I need to dive further into PRI. And so I started diving into it, but PRI is not something where you just do some internet research. No. It's more of a degree than it is just you going and doing some research. And so we took the courses, and when you take these courses, it just kind of makes your head spin and like you kind of get it, but it's just so much to wrap your head around. And then like perfect timing, we found your page. Jason and I are physical therapists. We found your page, and you were talking about these concepts and making it trainable and making it understandable for people like me. And then I reached out and we've been talking, and you've been helping me out ever since with my understanding of this stuff. And it's awesome. Like anybody who I've implemented this stuff with it is like, this is the truth. This is really good stuff. People who have tried every method, have tried everything, and they just can't get out of the pattern that they're in and the pain that they're in. And they try this stuff and it actually works. Yeah. So, that's all. It's funny though that your whole thing started with a back injury.
Yeah.
It's like that back injury had to happen for you to find this stuff.
Exactly.
And that's what I've talked about this a lot on the podcast, is like the best like injury prevention specialists got injured and they had to figure out how to get out of that. The best vertical jump coaches couldn't jump high and they had to figure out how to jump high. Like it's all kind of based on the limitations that we had as athletes.
Yeah.
So you mentioned, I'm just curious, you mentioned on the way over here, your brother works for Elon Musk.
Yeah.
So I'm just like, so you're one of the smartest people I know in this space. He works for Elon Musk. Like, what happened? What was your family doing? You guys just like, you're all just genius?
Oh no, man. We always joke that he was the one that got the brains and I got the brawn. He imagine the opposite of me in a person, like physically speaking.
Yeah.
That's him. So he's a very scrawny guy. Used to wear glasses, but he's just so incredibly smart. And I was always the athlete in the family, and he was the smart one. But I think, man, I'm not necessarily really smart. I think I've just spent a lot of time studying something and really getting reps, just implementing one thing for a very long time and trying to incorporate it with different things. And I think that's really what's helped me be able to teach this to other people and other coaches and implement it with a wide variety of populations. Because at the end of the day, it's just reps, just like anything else. You want to be a better jumper, then you better jump a lot. If you want to get really strong, you better squat a lot.
Yeah.
It's the same principle. So I don't necessarily think I'm smart. I just think I've been doing one thing for a long time and gotten a lot of reps with variability of people.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. Yeah. So you, which by the way, everybody, Jason knows, everybody's been making fun of me for saying that's awesome. Every time somebody says something, I go, that's awesome. And now I'm being made fun of it, so I can't say that anymore. But it is awesome. So anytime that I find somebody who is way smarter than me in a certain area, I always want to reach out, and the best way that I can learn is like, make me a program.
Yeah.
Like, let me do it. And you put together a program for me, and it was beautiful because it goes beyond the PRI. It's you're not just married to that.
Yeah.
It's a good overall strength and conditioning program, and you're using PRI where it needs to be, and everything is a tool, and you got to use that tool the right way. I feel like so many people find something that works, and it's like everything is this.
Yes.
And they're kind of closed off to other ideas. And I appreciated that, in the programs that you write, everything is very well balanced. It's very, very well mixed. For the people who don't understand anything about PRI, can you give us like a quick dummy course? Sure. PRI 101, like what's the deal?
So if you were to imagine that, let's go back to what we said about, we have a heart on the left, we have a liver on the right, we have a diaphragm that is asymmetrical. So just in that context, we understand that our trunk has certain asymmetries. So because of these asymmetries, our brain is also asymmetrical. We have a better ability to have higher dexterity on the right side of our body. So you would probably figure with that in mind that most people would probably be right-handed. So given that, and all these factors, the fact that like if we have ourselves divided down the middle vertically, we would weigh a little bit more on our right side. So because of these factors, and it's all a variety of influences, but because of them, we are going to probably load into our right side a little bit better. So for example, on a squat descent, you mentioned the force place and how most people would have more weight on their right foot. Mm-hmm. That's a largely influenced outcome of this asymmetry and how we load into our right side better. And the opposite inverse effect on our left side is we can push out of it better. And that's because our left side is in a state of propulsion more so than the right side. The right hip is in more of this orientation where it's backwards more. The right hip is back and the left hip tends to be more forward, which is why a lot of people like to shift to the right when load gets really heavy in a squat. And they like to jump off of their left leg a lot of the times, regardless of the fact of they're right or left-handed.
Yeah.
Now that can play into it, but that's not necessarily separate from the fact that you're asymmetrical.
Yeah, that's what we see with almost every basketball player is you're actually stronger weight room wise on your right. Mm-hmm. If you jump, you're bilateral, you're going to get more out of your right. from a standing position, sometimes you jump better from your right, but from a running position, always better from the left.
Yeah.
It's really interesting how that works. And it's not like it's almost always. It's like 90% of the time. Yeah. But there's always somebody had a bad ankle sprain on one side, and like you've mentioned before, okay, you're shifting away from that, and so now you're getting into entirely different patterns. But go on in our PRI 101 course.
Sure. I think you hit a really good point there about how you mentioned, like, well, what if someone isn't in this? Like, what if someone presents as something that's different? And
what percentage of people would you say that you see are not in this pattern?
I would say people start off there a lot of the times, and there are individual differences that exist within people. I'm not trying to say every human being's like this and it's only this way. There are differences. And so I would say when I assess someone, I would say probably about 75% of people will present that meets the expectations of this individual pattern.
Mm-hmm.
That is this right side dominance. We can load our right hip better, push out of our left better. When we can do that, let's imagine now that that right hip is back and that left hip is forward. What's your upper body going to do? Well, your body is trying to be balanced, right? It's not trying to be all over on the right side, because if your trunk turned to the right side too, you would probably walk in a circle to the right. So in order for us to balance that and counterbalance, we're going to relatively bring our right shoulder forward and down, because that means our trunk is rotating slightly to the left. But that doesn't mean we're literally turning and, it's like this big disaster. It's just now a little bit of turn is happening to allow us to balance ourselves out. Because the pelvis, I'm making these big movements with my hands, but that's just for the purposes of illustration. Really what's happening is it's a very slight rotation, and it's a very slight rotation forward, and it's a very slight rotation of the right shoulder coming forward. So I'd encourage people, when they're just walking down the street, when they're seeing people stand in a social circle and just talking, look at how many people are standing more on their right leg. Look at how many people have a lower right shoulder.
Dude, the lower right shoulder, you can't unsee it. Every airport I go to now, it's like, right shoulder droop constantly. And before, I never looked at that. And now I'm always looking at that right shoulder, and you just see it. It's so common.
It's so common, man. Also, other things to look out for is look at when people run, when your athletes sprint, look at them spend more time landing on the rear foot relative to the forefoot on the left. People love to strike the ground on more of their relative back foot on the right. That doesn't mean they're slapping the ground with their heel, but they're going to land a little bit more on the right midfoot and a little bit further forward on the left forefoot. And that's that representation of the left pelvis being a little bit forward. You can utilize that glute to push a little bit more forward on the left.
That's what we're seeing with the pressure mapping stuff. We're starting to get a lot of the pro dunkers to do the pressure mapping, and we're seeing where the pressure's at throughout the jump and kind of studying the different phases. And very early on the left side, they become forefoot dominant, while the right is actually still down. They want to keep that full ground contact for as long as possible. But the left, it's like it comes off the heel as soon as possible. It comes to the forefoot.
Definitely. I think that's why those force plates are such a good tool, because you can literally show people that this is a thing. Because you could tell people this all day and they're like, like, is this really a thing? And then you show them on an objective force plate measurement, like, oh yeah, now I really see what's going on here.
Totally.
So I think it's a great tool, but not everyone has a force plate. So there are different things that we can do to show people that they're asymmetrical. Like, different things you can do is just a basic straight leg raise test. Like, have someone lay on their back, have them pull one leg up. Most people do not have a symmetrical test result when they do that. You can measure things like hip flexion. You can have someone, the best way I like to do it with someone is just have them do a body weight squat for tempo. 5 seconds down, 5 seconds up. Have them do 10 reps just like that. I guarantee you on the 7th, 8th, 9th rep, you're going to see that hip shift to the left or the right, mostly the right in a lot of people, but you will oftentimes see sometimes a left hip shift. And we call that usually an additional compensation built on top of this pattern, because we've been living on this earth for, decades, right? And so if there's demands that are imposed on us that cause us to need to compensate to find a range of motion we don't have, then you're probably going to see compensations built up. And that's why I haven't seen one person ever that fits 100% strict of this PRI calls it the left AIC pattern, because everyone has different lifestyle demands. Everyone has different sport demands, and that's going to result in compensations. But I don't think that means those compensations are bad. I just think that those compensations happen because the body's trying to do what it needs to do to accomplish the task.
Right. Yeah, a lot of the best athletes are the best compensators. So it's not like everything they're doing is perfect. They're just better at other people than that, compensating and figuring out a new movement solution based on the pattern that they're already in.
Definitely.
And then as far as like so you talk about the left AIC. How about the PEC?
Sure. Good question.
Because I know they kind of refer to that as like the strength syndrome, the strength and conditioning guy.
Yes.
And I know a lot of people lift weights who are listening to this. So I think that might be important to talk about.
Yeah. So I would just encourage everyone that's listening to this, think about the people you know that lift a lot of weights, are really athletic, and they, for whatever reason, they have like a forward pelvis where you see like that big low back arch. That's like an anterior pelvic tilt that most people would probably recognize that term. What that is usually
Which is Instagram pose, Instagram model pose.
Instagram pose.
All right. So for all the 18-year-old basketball players listening to this, how do Instagram models pose? Okay. That's the anterior tilt.
It's that. Push your butt out, arch your back. That's anterior tilt.
Yeah.
A lot of people live in a slight degree of that. And what that really is it's one of two things. Either that person has demands placed on their body where they need to extend their back. When you jump, you better be able to extend your back. You better be able to find a place of extension. When you're pushing through a heavy squat, you better be able to extend your back and find that extension. And that usually is the body just getting a lot of one thing. And then it becomes adapted to that one thing. So that person is in a state of extension and chronic extension. And then both sides of the pelvis come forward on both sides. But that doesn't mean that it's now symmetrical. It just now means that the left is still relatively forward, but it's now both sides are forward. And that can happen because that body is trying to find a propulsive state, because that body is living in more of a propulsive state. So what you might see is this person has more weight relatively on their toes, and then they might feel, oh man, my hamstrings are now a little bit tight. But really what that is it's like that post you made, what's really good representation of imagining that rope being pulled from both ends, that band being stretched from both ends. That's that tight hamstring. It's not necessarily a chronically short hamstring. The overwhelming majority of people, when they feel that hamstring tightness, it's because they're in that PEC. It's because both sides of the pelvis are now forward and that hamstring is now long, but it feels tight. But of course it would feel tight if you took your muscle and pulled it from both ends.
Yeah. And then I think a lot of people make the association of like, oh, well, if my hamstrings are tight, then my back is going to hurt. But maybe the hamstrings over lengthen, and also because of that anterior tilt, your extensors are on all day trying to get your weight back, because you got to keep your head over your heels, right?
Yes.
And so your erectors are constantly firing all day. And then you go in the weight room and you put a bar on your back, and we're more and more and more extension. And so some of these people just keep feeding that, in my opinion. And so what are some basic strategies to get out of that PEC?
I think the most important thing is to recognize when we're in this forward pelvic orientation, our breathing strategy is going to be thrown off, along with our variability to find different joint orientations. So, for example, if I had my pelvis forward on both sides, you made a really good point right there about how when we're forward, the pelvis is forward. So our upper body's like, man, I'm falling really far forward. I need to extend my back even more so I can have that neutral line going down my head into my midfoot, because the body just wants to seek balance. So when that happens, your ribs are probably going to flare and you're going to start breathing through your belly. You're not going to be able to get your rib cage to breathe. You're going to miss that diaphragmatic breathing that a lot of people are talking about. So it's important to think about the muscles that are going to bring your pelvis back on both sides first to get you out of that PEC pattern. So that's going to be a lot of obliques, and that's going to be a lot of hamstrings, usually. Now, what's interesting is that when we exhale, our obliques need to kick on. When we exhale forcefully and for a long time, or just for a long time and more relaxed even. If you exhaled through your mouth, or just with an open mouth, like for a long time, you would feel your obliques kick on. I would hope so.
Yeah.
And then that's going to bring your pelvis back on both sides. Now, if you can activate your hamstrings, and you can get them to fire alongside the exhale and the hamstrings kicking on, then that pelvis is going to posteriorly tilt. It's going to come back on both sides. And then if you can maintain that through a duration of an exercise or a set of breaths in a certain position, then you're going to be able to give your body that input, and you're going to get that diaphragmatic breathing. You're going to get that pelvis to come back on both sides. You're going to get your hamstrings to shorten, which is actually good in the context of what we're talking about right now. And then you're going to get a lot of what you're looking for. It's a big bang for your buck activity.
Yeah.
A very popular one is that 90-90 position that a lot of people have seen. There's a reason for that. But a lot of people will execute that drill and they'll say, it's not working for me, but I bet you're probably just not doing it right.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of cues. There's a lot of like little details that have to go right for you to feel it. And then once you feel it, you're like, oh, that's what I've been missing all along. I asked you a question a few weeks ago on that. I was like, look, if I'm in that 90-90 position and I'm trying to get my obliques, should I do a forceful exhale? Because I feel my obliques more when I do a forceful exhale. And you're like, no, we don't want this to be fight or flight. Like, we don't want this to be sympathetic driven, because then your body's not going to want to get into that position. Elaborate on that a little bit.
Great point. Yeah. So I think when people start to breathe for the first time or learn how to breathe for the first time, what they'll do is they'll just exhale really hard and then they're going to kick on all their abs. And that's good, right? Because people want their abs to kick on. That's not necessarily the best thing, because a lot of people have six-pack abs. They're rectus abs. Those abs are usually trying to take over for a lack of function within the obliques. So your six-pack does have a small minor role in exhalation, but if it's doing everything for your exhalation, then your obliques are not going to kick on when they need to kick on. They're going to be in a disadvantaged state. So what we really want to do is encourage a longer and softer exhale rather than a forceful and short exhale. But so many people are used to putting a bunch of weight on their back and exhaling really hard and holding their breath and all that stuff. But that's not necessarily what we need to do in these drills. These are lower level, lower intensity drills where we just need to get some of that parasympathetic input back in our lives.
Right.
Because the weight room, a 1-rep max squat, is very sympathetic, but a parasympathetic rest and digest input is going to be, let's chill. Let's treat this more like meditation rather than a 1-rep max squat. And that's a nice cue for a lot of people, because then they're going to tell their body like, hey, this is a safe place for me to be. This is a safe space, rather than, hey, I'm doing a 1-rep max squat right now. This is going to kick on every muscle in my body, and this is going to be a threat to my body, rather than me telling my body, this is a position where I can live. This is a position where I can breathe. And if you can breathe through a position, you can own it.
Right. So another question I've asked you in the past, okay, I get that your hamstrings might feel tight, not because they're short, but because they're over lengthened. But then the hip flexors in this pattern are short, correct? Mm-hmm. If I'm anteriorly tipped, my hip flexors are short. But most people would assume that you're in the anterior tilt because your psoas is causing this.
Yes.
Is your psoas causing this, or is it just a byproduct of this pattern that you're in?
Another great question. I'm glad you asked that. So a lot of people think, let me use the example of a mini band. I think I'll tie this together. This is a really good way to hit a couple of different points here. So if I were to do, people see those mini band walks, right?
Yeah.
Where they put a band around their knees, they walk side to side, and they're like, this is great. I'm going to get my glute med to turn on.
Yeah, totally.
So what they're doing with that, whether they're consciously aware of it or not, is that when they're walking and they're trying to turn their glute med on, what they're saying is, my glute med's not working right. So when I activate it by walking sideways, I'm going to turn that muscle on. And if I do that enough times, my pelvis or my hips are going to assume a new position because my muscle is now doing something that it wasn't. And then if I do that enough, then my brain will start to say, hey, that's safe and I can do that. But in my opinion, it works the exact opposite of that. I think the brain is constantly scanning and constantly aware of previous injuries, your current flexibility, your current limb lengths, like all these other influences. And it's so multifactorial what's feeding into what your brain is going to deem safe and unsafe. And then it's going to get into the skeletal position that it deems the best for whatever demands your sport is having you do, whatever demands your lifestyle is, how much you sit, how much you stand, how much you walk, all these things. And then your muscles are going to take on an orientation secondary to that skeletal position. So for example, if I sit all day and I'm in this position where my hip flexors are chronically short, but that's because I'm in a position of skeletal hip flexion. So then when I stand up, I'm going to adapt to the demands imposed on my body, which is skeletal hip flexion, because my hip flexors are in a lengthened position. So when I stand up, my skeleton is now in hip flexion, and then my hip flexors are short secondary to that. Another example would be if I'm going to squat in a position of anterior pelvic tilt. We see this all the time. People will squat down and then maybe they'll have some butt wink where their hips roll under them, and then they finish out the rep, but they're still extended. They're still stuck.
Yeah.
That is a skeleton that pelvis is forward. It's not going into that posterior orientation and finishing with a nice even pelvis. So then the hip flexors are going to be in a chronically shortened state throughout the duration of that squat. And then they're not actually going to get the variability of lengthening and shortening. And so we might say those hip flexors are really, really strong because they're obviously pulling our pelvis forward. It's like, no, those hip flexors just don't have the variability. They don't have the ability to lengthen and contract, because for a muscle to be able to contract optimally, it needs to lengthen. Think about doing a bicep curl. If I were to do a bicep curl from right here, it's not going to be very good. But if I started from all the way down there, I'm going to get a much stronger contraction. I'm going to be able to create that leverage within my joints, with my tissues, to have that elbow flexion occur. So just because a muscle is short does not mean it is strong.
Yeah. Wow. That's awesome. That's such a long-lasting myth.
Yeah.
In the strength and conditioning world. So I know that there's a lot of kids that are listening to that, and they're like, their question is, but should I still stretch? Should I still stretch the hip flexors? What are your thoughts there?
I don't think stretching is necessarily bad. I think stretching can get a bad rep, but I don't think that it is necessarily the most optimal way for many people to go about addressing muscle length. There's a lot of data out there that is very conflicting with static stretching in particular. We can talk about dynamic stretching as well, but with static stretching, there's a lot of data that suggests that the adaptations that occur in the muscle are not actually lengthening the muscle. What we're really doing is increasing the tolerance of the muscle to actually stretch. And that's not doing what most people think a stretch is doing. It's like, oh, I'm so much more flexible. It's like, no, you just improved your muscle's ability to go into an orientation where it can handle that stretch. But that does not mean that when you stand up, that hip flexor is going to be in a longer orientation. Now, that doesn't mean it's not helpful, because you are technically reducing the tone within that muscle. But that doesn't mean that that muscle is going to be elongated. In fact, a lot of the studies suggest that it's not even more for 5 or 20 minutes.
Yeah.
And then it just goes back to what
away.
it was, because of course it is, because muscles are secondary to skeletal position, as we mentioned. So what we would probably want to think about instead is, what can I do to facilitate a longer muscle length with potentially the muscle on the other side of the joint? And we can take the hamstrings, for example. So let's go back to that idea of taking a hamstring and shortening it. And then what is the muscle on the other side of the joint, the hip flexor, going to have to do in that instance?
Yeah, it's going to have to lengthen.
It's going to have to lengthen. So we would probably want to think more along those lines. And I don't think stretching is like I said, it's not a bad tool. I think it's a tool. But if we want to have longer lasting interventions, we should start to think about what skeletal positions do we need to put ourselves in. So a posterior pelvic tilt, tucking your hips in this instance, in that 90-90 hip lift, or a position that facilitates your hips to extend, which would be the opposite of hip flexion, utilizing the muscles that extend your hip. And then if you can breathe through that on top of it, then you're also going to be taking care of other influences like your rib cage position. Because if your ribs are super flared, then that's going to push you into hip flexion, so you can get those obliques on as well. Then that's going to help facilitate that a little bit better, and in my opinion, will result in longer lasting outcomes.
Right. So if the muscle is short, it may not be optimal to strengthen it, but it may not hurt. If the muscle is over lengthened, so like the hamstrings when we're in this pattern, is that going to hurt it? Or is it still the same scenario? You're not going to do any harm, but it's not also not the best.
So I think that's actually a really good point and topic we should probably hit, of this idea, going back to the fact that just because a muscle is short does not mean it is strong. I think, and I'm of the opinion that if we were to actually train those muscles, let's take that short hip flexor, through a elongated position back to a shortened position again, through a full range of motion, I would bet you that would probably do more for people's tight hip flexors than constantly stretching, because at least and then you're getting that eccentric tolerance of the hip flexor. You're getting the ability for the muscle to elongate, which is going to allow it to stretch. And then if you can keep a degree of control over your pelvis when you do that, and then when it contracts, it's going to go through its full arc, which is exactly what that muscle would want to do when you're sprinting, when you're running, when you're jumping, and all of that good stuff. So the opposite, if we were to think about the hamstrings, for example, if I have a chronically elongated muscle, then I would probably, at least for a little while, want to avoid very eccentric, elongated focus in my exercise. So for example, a Romanian deadlift, which has a long hamstring moment, which is going to put a lot of eccentric stress on the hamstring. I probably wouldn't program 10 sets of those in one workout. But I might want to think about doing things like TRX hamstring curls, slider hamstring curls, where I can maintain control over my pelvis and train it concentrically in more of a shortened state. And this doesn't have to be something that we do for 3 months. Maybe it's just for a little while to give your hamstring an ability to contract from an elongated state. Then we can start adding in that other stuff. But I think also a lot of people can go and they can do lots of RDLs, they can do all this stuff, and sometimes they won't have any issues. And I think it depends on the individual. It depends on your limitations and what your sport is and what your demands are and how injury prone you are. If you don't have any issues, like we were just talking earlier, there's a lot of athletes out there that just don't have any issues. And I would assess this person and say, hey, you don't check out 100% great biomechanically, yet you've never been injured in your life. And I think there's something to appreciate and respect about that.
Right. Definitely. This is sort of getting away from the PRI conversation, but I'm interested because we're kind of talking about this with concentric versus eccentric, full range of motion for lengthening. Do you feel like concentric-based lifts can have the potential to make you more tight because we're not going through that lengthening? So maybe not even lifts, maybe stationary bike where it's concentrically driven and I don't get any lengthening. Is that going to shorten my muscle fibers?
I think anything that you do for a prolonged period of time without any additional variability placed on top of that is going to have your body adapt to those demands. So I think a really good example of this is a power lifter. Someone that has 3 main lifts they care about: bench, squat, deadlift, and that's it. Or someone like a gym bro who just doesn't do anything besides those 3 lifts. We all know what these people look like. They're very stiff, they're very immobile, but they're really good at producing stiffness and being strong. But that's because they don't have any other variability. So likewise, if I put myself on that stationary bike and only did stationary biking, then I would probably start to become very much representing within my skeleton and posture what I would be on that stationary bike. But if we provided just even a little bit of variability, even just a little bit of frontal plane work, transverse rotational work, then we would be much less, at least in my opinion, prone to adapting to that posture position and then lacking the variability within our joints and our muscles. So I feel like a lot of people could just benefit from just doing a little bit more of this frontal plane, sideways movement, rotational movement, transverse plane movement, and that would go so far for them to not have to think about all these crazy concepts and then just focus on the basics. And that can take care of a lot.
Yeah, so it's almost like hop off the Peloton and don't just stretch, hop off the Peloton and go through a 15-minute full body circuit of a deep squat and a lateral lunge and that kind of stuff.
Definitely.
Yeah. Anything else on PRI that people would need to know as far as a crash course?
I think in terms of the influences within the scapula and the shoulder blades and how the shoulder works in general, a lot of people think the shoulder is this sort of like structure that's a separate entity than anything else, right? Like, okay.
People really don't think they know that the knees are connected and the hips and the ankles, but then the shoulder, like, oh yeah, you're on your own, man.
It's like this is like its own thing and it's not connected to anything else. But really, like, the number one thing people don't consider when it comes to the shoulder is the position of the rib cage. Because the rib cage is where the shoulder blade and the scapula sits. So our spine has a natural curve. Our low back needs to extend and arch a little bit, but then our thoracic and upper spine needs to flex a little bit. And then our neck, cervical spine goes into a little bit more extension. That flexion in the thorax is so important because our scapula, our shoulder blade, is a slightly rounded structure like this. And so that flexion allows for that scapula to glide very smoothly on that posterior rib cage and also the thoracic spine. If suddenly we were very extended, we had a big low back arch or a stiff upper back, that scapula's got nowhere to go. And people can feel this on themselves, actually. If you were to arch your back really hard and then try to get your arm overhead like this, keeping your elbow perfectly straight ahead, it's really difficult. But if you get some flexion, it's so much easier.
Yeah.
That's a perfect representation of what's going on there. So if your scapula can't move because of your rib cage position, then you can do all the shoulder mobility drills in the world. But that's probably not going to have a significant effect on your ability to actually have that variable mobility that you're looking for if you don't think about the position of the rib cage, if you can't get some flexion in your upper back. And that doesn't mean we should do things where we're extremely flexed and rounded all the time. It just is, can we even breathe back there? And this is another big thing that PRI talks about a lot, is the fact that when we inhale, we actually need to have some expansion. Our back needs to actually open up a little bit. And that allows for that flexion to happen within the back when we inhale. But if we're chronically extended, we inhale, all that air is going into our belly. And then you start to get only belly breathing. And then we can talk about belly breathing too if you want. That's a whole nother rabbit hole.
I was going to ask about, a lot of people understand the importance of the feet, and then people understand the importance of the pelvis, and you get different ideas of like, everything stems from the feet, everything adapts to that, or other people are like, pelvis is the centerpiece of the body, everything happens from the pelvis, and then the feet respond to that. When you're doing assessments, are you seeing one or the other? Is like, are the feet adapting to the pelvic position, or is it the other way around?
Great question. I think there's two influences. There's top down, as you mentioned, but also bottom up. Our foot is the first thing to obviously hit the ground. It's the first thing to interact with the ground, which sends basically an entire cascade of signaling back up to our pelvis, all the way up to our cranium and head. So we can't ignore the fact that the foot is going to be the thing that is going to give that influence back up. But if our pelvis is in a position that doesn't allow our feet to get that proper gait cycle, that proper transition from the heel to the toe, and then from the other heel to the toe. Let's say, for example, my hips were forward on both sides. Then my weight is more on my forefoot. And then when I strike the ground, I'm not going to be able to go to heel to toe in just normal walking. Normally, I'm probably going to go more midfoot to toe. And then the gait cycle is interrupted. And then my foot position during walking or running is interrupted. And then I'm not going to be able to have the ability to get that bottom up influence. So when I address someone, I'm almost always assuming there are no glaring things going on within the foot or the shin or the knee. I'm almost always going to start with things more proximal, closer to the midline of our body, like our pelvis and our rib cage, because those are the big boys that influence that top-down ability for the gait cycle to even happen in the first place. But I think it's important to not separate these two things from each other, because let's say, for example, I only did hip mobility stuff and I thought not about the feet at all, then I would probably be handicapped myself a little bit on that, because I think when we do a drill, we should be thinking, okay, so let's say, for example, I wanted to get someone to feel their heel more when they struck the ground and get a little bit more heel reference so that they could have that nice heel to toe. I would probably want to put them in a position where they are going to recruit the muscles that should be happening when we are striking the ground with our heel. That is usually some degree of hamstring, and that is some degree of also our oblique should be firing a little bit, and we should also be in a slight posterior pelvic orientation. When we strike the ground with our foot, we start to move towards a posterior pelvic orientation from a place of anterior orientation. So when we go through that, we are going to basically need to create a neurological association between the heel, the hamstring, and also a slight posterior pelvic tilt. Because then we're going to educate our brain of, hey, when my heel's on the ground, I want this hamstring to start to posteriorly orient and create hip extension. Because when we strike the ground, we go heel, midfoot, where hip extension happens, and then that leg is straight. So we're going to start to educate the body in that manner. Or we could just do all these different isolated hip mobility drills, and then we're not really educating the body on what we want to happen when we want it to happen.
Right. Yeah, that's good stuff. I've asked you this question before. I think you might have made a post on this. I know Gary Ward has talked about this, I believe, in his book, What the Foot. But we see a lot of the toe outs. We see a lot of the duck walk, especially kind of with after quarantine, more people are sitting, and it seems like sitting for whatever reason. You probably know the reason. But for whatever reason, I think when people are sedentary, it seems like they're kind of more duck walkers. But you had an interesting point on it about how it's very possible that maybe they don't know how to pronate, and so they're finding a way to get off that, feel the big toe. Elaborate on that a little bit.
Sure. So when we go through this normal gait cycle, like let's say this is my heel, this is my big toe right here. We strike the ground with our heel, then we roll, and our arch needs to drop, and then we push off through our big toe, and our arch re-rises again.
And when he says arch drop, that doesn't mean that like the pinky toe's coming off.
Yes.
A lot of people, they make that mistake. They think that pronation is bad because they associate it with complete like ankle collapse.
Great. Yeah, great point. Because real pronation is relative motion between the forefoot and the rear foot. So if this is the back of my foot right here, this is the front of my foot, really what's happening is it's more of a rotation like this, rather than the whole thing just flopping inwards. Really, this goes out and then this goes in more so. So it's more of this rotation like so. This is really what pronation is rather than that. So it's important to recognize that. I'm glad you said that, because pronation is a natural thing that needs to happen, and we need to find it, because that's our arch dropping, which allows us to shift our body weight over that foot. Because if we had a rigid foot when our body weight was trying to go over that foot, we would probably fall off to the side, because we can't get that yielding. We can't get those tissues to elongate to get our body weight over there. So when someone can't pronate properly, then usually what someone likes to do is find a strategy or compensation to do it. So a lot of times, let's say, for example, through a normal heel to toe, they just couldn't find that pronation. They might turn their foot out. So now when they strike the ground, they're going to strike with more of the inside of their heel, and then their foot is going to go right into the inner edge, and then they're going to for sure pronate then. But then they're compromised with their ability to re-rise that arch. So it's a give and take a little bit. But again, doesn't mean it's necessarily a problem. It's a problem when it becomes a problem, and then this person starts to get injured, or there's significant red flags within their movement. So just because these things exist do not mean they are bad, but they could be red flags for other things, other limitations happening. Another way you can see it is if you have, let's say, that anterior pelvic tilt where the pelvis is forward on both sides. What that does is that biases our leg bones, our femurs, to turn inwards into internal rotation. So if everything is going into internal rotation, what you could see is the lower leg bones, the tibias, the shins, turn outward to find a degree of external rotation, because we need to constantly be going through internal and external rotation on both sides. That's the whole name of the game, is to be able to do both. It's not like one is bad and one is good. It's depending on the context of movement, it's going to be appropriate at one time or another, but both need to happen. So if we're only in internal rotation, when the pelvis tips forward, that's what happens, then our shins might need to find that external rotation. So they might turn out, and then you have that duck foot presentation. And this can happen on one or both sides.
Yeah, interesting. As far as knee valgus, we've talked about knee valgus a lot on like dynamic knee valgus, because so many jumpers do get to some degree of it in a standing vertical jump. But as far as like your structure, you've always been valgus. Is there something that you can do about it? How curable is this without surgery? Do you think that it's kind of one, is it a problem? And two, is this something that you feel like you can really change?
I think knee valgus gets a bad rep because naturally the human body actually has a degree of knee valgus. If I were to just stand up, you look at a skeleton, just bones, the knees have this inward sort of V curve, and that's totally normal. But also when we jump or when we squat or when we do anything that requires internal rotation, then we should have a very slight degree of knee valgus or more, depending on how, let's say, how deep that cut is. Then your knee is going to go inwards. If it doesn't, you're not going to be very agile. So when this internal rotation needs to happen, when we produce force, then that is not necessarily a problem, because what should be happening under normal circumstances is the femur internally rotates the leg bone, coupled with the shin internally rotating, coupled with pronation at the foot. Those are normal mechanics. So if I see someone that does that, if I see someone who has that internal rotation all the way down, the foot pronates, then I'm going to say, okay, that's probably not necessarily a problem. We see this with basketball players a lot. A lot of them have that push and their knee goes in, but you never see them necessarily get hurt. Look at Kyrie Irving. He does it all the time. Crazy handles. His knees are in all the time. But yeah, he has some knee issues, but he's not always hurt.
Yeah.
And I don't necessarily think it's because of that. I've never assessed Kyrie. Maybe he doesn't do it very well.
Well, Allen Iverson too.
Allen
really
Iverson.
Anybody who's extremely shifty,
Yeah.
Kemba Walker, I mean, anybody who's extremely shifty, you're going to see those knees going in a lot.
Yeah, it's very common in basketball athletes.
Yeah.
Very common in baseball athletes as well, or really a lot of sports, football athletes.
Yeah.
That those knees go in, and I think that's okay, but it starts to be an issue if you're seeing things fight each other. Let's say the femur is going inwards, but then the shin bone goes outwards. That's what we refer to as knee valgus. These things are now torqued, and there's rotation happening that is opposing each other. And then you've got this, and then the knee goes inwards. That's when you start to see those ACLs go, those MCLs, other knee ligaments, the meniscus. That's when you start to see those issues. But again, you also see people do this all the time, and it's not the prettiest thing ever, but they don't have any injuries. So I always come back to this question of, if they're a great athlete, how much should we intervene with their mechanics?
Right.
It's the eternal question, I think. But in terms of addressing it, I think the number one thing we can do is build resiliency within the tissues, within the ligaments, within the tendons, within the musculature around the knee. So you better be good at doing plyos. You better be good at multi-directional plyos. You better be able to handle eccentric and concentric forces. And I think that's the number one thing we can do. I actually think mechanics are secondary to that. Mm-hmm. Also, making sure that you got the basics taken care of. Are you sleeping enough? Are you taking care of your nutrition? Because I think we can start to think about the mechanics, but people are so much more prone to injuries if they don't take care of those basic things first. But in terms of the mechanics, I think we can start to restore variability to the pelvis and also the foot. The foot is supposed to be more of a mobile joint, the knee more stable, and then the hip more of a mobile joint. So if our pelvis and our leg can go through the necessary internal and external rotation when appropriate, as well as our foot can go through that pronation and supination when appropriate, then I don't think that knee is going to have a reason to cave in too much, because that knee isn't going to need to compensate, because knee valgus is a compensation for a lack of mobility properly in the right context. So if we train that femur, hip, and also foot to go through the appropriate joint actions together, then I think, and I believe, and I have seen that we can actually reduce this knee valgus, because we are going to train that to happen at the right time and under the right context.
Right, 100%. Then another question that I get a lot is, obviously things like ankle mobility are so important for basketball players to make these moves that Allen Iverson's making. If you pause it at the right time, you see just how forward his shin is. Mm-hmm. And it's the Kobe, same thing, just insane ankle mobility. Do you believe that this is something that's mainly genetic? It's like, this is just how your ankle structure is built? Or do you feel like this is something we can significantly improve? If we can significantly improve it, do you do it through these traditional ankle mobility drills, or do we just load it through strength training in a full range?
I think
that's a loaded question.
It's a great question, though. I think it's multifactorial in the sense that it depends. The biggest factor, I think, if you're going to change any sort of flexibility, it's how old are you? I think that's the number one thing to think about, because if you've got an 80-year-old grandpa good luck getting him to really change his movement and flexibility. If you're younger though, then I think that you are still very nimble and your tissues have not, for lack of a better term, solidified into the state that through puberty, that process is ongoing. And then beyond puberty, you can make the argument that you are now in a degree of like really the myelination process has finished. And you're in this position now where you can probably get more flexible, but less so than if you were younger and still going through the process of developing and solidifying what your joints and tissues are capable of. And then we can layer genetics on top of that. So I think genetics, nothing you can do about it. But if when you're younger, you're exposing yourself constantly to different stresses, different positions, and just getting a lot of different movement happening. If you're playing, I think that's just what it is. If you're playing, then I think that's going to allow you to access those high levels of mobility. So I think that's why you see these basketball players with crazy amounts of mobility, ankle mobility. So they were probably doing that for a long time when they were young and through puberty. But if we do want to actually make a change, I think it's important to respect what's actually happening at the pelvis and at the foot. I'm kind of like a broken record here, but I think that's kind of like what we need to start to think about.
Which, when you're a broken record, that thing probably matters. The thing you keep going back to, it just matters that much that everything comes back to that.
Exactly. Let's relate the pelvis to the foot again. So let's say we got that forward pelvis, and then that foot is constantly having more weight pushed forward on it. So imagine that you now tried to push your knee over your toe. And when you do a calf raise, for example, when you're on your forefoot and you try to basically push into the ground and stand on your tiptoes, that is plantar flexion. That is that joint action of your calf working, and then you go up. The opposite of dorsiflexion, which is what most people think of as ankle mobility, where the knee goes over the toe and the heel is flat on the floor. That right there needs to happen with the calf in an elongated position. But if you're constantly on your forefoot and your calves are constantly on in this shortened state, then how much success are you going to have constantly trying to stretch your way into better ankle mobility when you can't even get on your back foot because of the position of your pelvis? That's a consideration a lot of people don't think about a lot.
Which is common. I've talked about this a lot on the podcast, and actually our last guest is a podiatrist, and he's like, we see tight calves over and over and over again, and they stretch out the calves all day. They do all this ankle mobility stuff, and their calves are still tight. And it probably goes back to that. Absolutely.
Yeah. If you're only looking at the foot in isolation, then I think you're leaving a lot on the table for what you could do, because these things are so interconnected, you can't separate one from the other. And I think it's just a matter of people understanding these things, because once they're educated, they see, oh, okay, now if I actually get my pelvis to come back, then I can actually now access more ankle mobility. And that's something that can be said for any structure within the body. If you're trying to improve your shoulder mobility, maybe you need to think about what your pelvis is doing in that. Maybe if you're trying to improve, I don't know, your hip mobility, maybe you need to think about other structures influencing that as well. So it's all about understanding and appreciating that things are connected and you can't separate one from the other, because we have fascia, we have all these different tissues. Like literally, if I were to take out a cadaver or just any sort of like tissue within the body, you could not make a conscious separation in your mind of what these tissues are, because they're so connected through fascia, this hard tissue that is basically a layer on top of the muscle. So I've seen a lot of different muscles that were dissected, and they're literally just sheets. Like with the fascia on top of them, there's no chance you could differentiate the muscles from one another until you get that fascia off of there.
Yeah.
And then you can start to make those other differentiations. Oh, this is this muscle, this is that muscle. But literally from your foot all the way up to your shoulder, these fascial lines run.
Right.
And that's why you can't separate them.
Right. That's awesome. Jason's got a question.
I got a question from the audience. Could you describe your approach or the compensations you might look for with an athlete with recurrent ankle sprains?
That's a great one, especially for our audience.
Fantastic.
Basketball
question.
players
Yeah.
always spraining the ankles. I think it's
Yeah.
the number one most common injury in basketball.
And there's a reason for that. There's actually a good bit of, I think Steph Curry is a really good example of that. You remember when Steph Curry had those ankle
Yeah.
injuries that just kept
That could have
happening?
ended his career.
Sure could.
It
Yeah.
was probably pretty close to ending his career.
Yeah, I remember that. And he just like came back and he's just became an MVP. But he had a great physical therapist, I think. So when it comes to these ankle injuries, there's a lot of data that suggests that a lot of these ankle injuries occur on the outside of our foot. There's 3 particular ligaments on our lateral outside foot that tend to become sprained more than other ones. I'm not saying these are the only ligaments that get sprained in the foot. I'm saying these are probably the most common. And that's because a lot of ankle sprains happen when the foot goes out like this. It's relatively rare to see a sprain where the foot goes in and then these inner ligaments are sprained. It's usually mostly on the outside. Now, what happens is when we sprain that, then those ligaments become stretched a little bit, depending on how significant it is, more or less, but they still, regardless, get stretched a little bit. And actually, you would think that that foot is now weak, so maybe that arch would collapse in. But it's actually in this context of when you sprain those ligaments, what actually ends up happening is that foot actually turns and supinates and the arch rises even more because those ligaments are now on slack. So if you were to imagine those ligaments were lengthened, then they would probably result in, this would happen. They would fall out because when those ligaments contract, they actually hold the ability for the foot to stay there. So when they're elongated, you basically just have this foot roll out. So you're actually I think the data is you have a 33% chance higher rate of respraining that same foot when you have an ankle sprain, which are pretty crappy odds. Like if you broke your arm and your doctor told you have a 33% chance of breaking your arm again, you probably wouldn't be too happy.
Yeah.
So that's essentially what's happening within your ankle there. So really when it comes to ankle sprains, it's all about re-educating the foot to trust the ability to bear weight on that side again. Because what a lot of people will do is they will end up just not trusting that foot. And then imagine that you didn't trust your ability to bear weight on your right foot because you sprained it pretty bad back in the day. You would probably start to shift over to your left side. And then you might start to see compensations at your pelvis. And then that's going to feed up into your upper body.
Yeah.
But it all started right there.
Yeah. That's why I'm so on our players of every little sprained ankle, you rehab it the right way. Sprained ankle can cause problems all the way up the body. Even when the ankle itself heals, you got these other compensations. So good to hear that from other people, because I'm always telling our athletes that, and they're like, yeah, I'm fine. You know, a lot of these guys are warriors, and that's why they can go out and play 82 games in a row, is because they're so tough mentally. And they can push through pain. But there's also a time to be like, hey man, just rehab this the right way, because it could cause problems down the line. But that makes so much sense, because I had the worst sprained ankle when I was an intern. I was telling you, I got to work with a lot of really high level players. And we went out and I was playing against Darrell Rivas, legendary corner, which, by the way, this dude, man, best defender I've ever played against.
Really?
I've played against so many NBA players, and my crossover works against everybody. I might get blocked from behind with some of these guys with length, but my crossover is going to work. I'm going to get in the lane, not against Darrell Rivas. He sees things that fast. It's like that's his entire job is read and react. But yeah, best defender I've ever played against. But then he didn't really know how to work the pick and roll very well. So I started calling for screens every time and started working the pick and roll. We had game point, and I was driving, and I got tackled from behind, and I came down with all their body weight on my ankle.
Was it him that tackled you?
I don't know. I never figured out who tackled me. I don't know if it was him or his teammate. We were playing 2-on-2.
Okay.
I don't even know. All I remember is I came down on my ankle, and I was like, I'm done. That's it. This is the worst sprained ankle I've ever had. Couldn't put any pressure on or anything. And then it's funny, the people listening to this, anybody who was on my first ever program, which was filmed on my phone, I was balancing it on a cone, but you can go back and you can see that I was wearing an ankle brace through the full thing. So I was rushing to get that program out. And so I didn't rehab it at all. And I could barely put pressure on it, but I was doing plyometrics to get this program out. I was demoing plyometrics. And I knew that I was setting myself up for failure, but I just kept doing it. and I filmed a year's worth of content on that sprained ankle. Afterwards, my foot was in so much supination. My right foot was so high. Like I had the biggest arch, and it just made no sense to me.
Yeah.
And that was it. And it took years to finally get it comparable to where the left is.
Yeah.
So I bet that is the same thing that you're describing.
Yeah, you'd figure it would just collapse, right? Because like, that's what we associate a weak foot with. Well, actually, like what you see in a lot of high-level performing athletes is that foot is actually kind of flat. And I don't think that's a problem, because a lot of people think flat foot equals bad. I don't necessarily think that. I think a lot of people are using that pronation strategy to actually push. And usually, so what actually needs to happen when we push off is the arch kind of goes into that pronation like we mentioned, but that actually creates a stretch of the tissues on the bottom of our foot, which allows and causes a chain reaction up into our pelvis to where that's going to spring our arch back up, and that's going to actually create the hip to allow that hip to extend, and all those muscles are going to fire through a lot of that fascial connection, through that interconnectedness of our muscles and joints and tissues. That stretch at the foot causes that. It's going to be a lot harder to do that if you've got a really supinated foot. So I think that you see it a lot, and I'm glad you brought up the sprained foot idea, because you see this a lot with people that sprint and have had that sprain. You often see an inability to push off quite as well as the other side, and you start to see these asymmetries build and build. But if that foot was just educated to learn how to pronate again properly, and then also build up some strength within the resiliency of those tissues on the bottom of the foot, then I think we can start to get that body and brain to trust having weight on that side. But oftentimes you see, I got to get off this side. I got to get off it really quick.
Yeah. Wow. That's so good. I can't say that's awesome. That's so good. Okay, speed round. I like to do a speed round, so you can't think much about this. You got to tell me what your intuition says. Got to do it quick, and then you can explain it.
Sure.
So you're a basketball fan, and you live in Portland. Who would the Blazers need to get to win an NBA championship? Is there one player? Are they one player away?
Ooh, they're one player away. Yeah, they are. Yeah, they are. Oh, man. Oh, gut reaction. Who have I always wanted? I would want a 3-and-D wing, someone kind of like, I've always thought Chris Middleton would be a good fit.
You think?
I don't know if he's the guy, but
I think he makes him a 3 seed.
You think so?
I don't think he puts him over the Lakers or the Nets.
No, I'm thinking realistic. It's realistic and someone that we could actually maybe get. But if I'm picking one player, nothing else considered, I would probably say Giannis.
Yeah.
Giannis.
You think that team with Giannis wins?
He's got defense. He's going to be a post threat, and then we got 3-point shooting all around him.
I like it. See, I think if KD went to Portland, they win.
Oh, that'd be nasty.
And I think if LeBron went to Portland, they win.
Oh yeah.
So I'm weirdly a Blazers fan, and I don't know why, but I am. Like, I'm not really a fan of teams. I'm a fan of players. Anybody that we work with, I root for them, and so I kind of stopped rooting for teams. But the Blazers have always been somebody that I'm so interested in. And I think it's because I love Dame. I love CJ. Both of them weren't highly recruited. I think I identify with their story really well of how they got there. And then they got my boy Shabazz Napier, which that's my favorite Blazers team. I don't care what anybody says. That's my favorite Blazers team.
Who else was on that squad? It was him. Was LaMarcus Aldridge on that squad too?
Maybe. Or did he come the year later? I don't think he was there. I think he came after that.
Wes Matthews was on that squad.
Wes Matthews, Nurk. They had the other shooter. Who was that kind of 3-and-D guy?
Oh.
They had Noah Vonleh.
Yeah.
They had Zach Collins.
That was probably his rookie year, huh?
Yeah, it was his rookie year.
I'm trying to think of that 3-and-D guy you're referring to. Was it Aminu?
They had Aminu.
They had
Aminu. And then they had one other guy. I don't remember. He was kind of inconsistent, but he kind of had some big games. Yeah. But that's my favorite Blazers team. And they would play those three together. When they played Baz and CJ and Dame together, that's the most fun I've had watching basketball.
Oh, yeah, man.
And statistically, they were good, but they didn't always go back to it. But
not a lot of defense there.
No, there's not. That's a very undersized defense for sure. But offensively, they were so much fun to watch. And so I spent a lot of time up there in Portland around the arena and stuff. So I kind of became a Portland fan. Any other teams that you're a fan of? Or is it just like Portland ride or die?
You know, football speaking, I'm a massive Saints fan, which is
That's
weird.
random.
Yeah, it is random because when I was growing up, my dad liked the 49ers, and I just wanted to pick a team that my dad didn't like, so I picked that one. Turned out I really liked the Saints, and I got into them really much. But in terms of basketball, I've always really liked the story of the process.
Yeah.
Of the 76ers. I've always liked that story.
Yeah.
I'm a big Sam Hinkie guy. I really like that squad.
Yeah.
I really enjoy Joel Embiid. I think he is an extremely charismatic, extremely passionate person, and I'm all for someone who is good at all realms of life. And I think I'm a big fan of Joel and Ben, despite the fact that they're not the most perfect marriage on the court.
Right. What is the worst trend in strength and conditioning in 2021?
Ooh.
There's so many bad ones. Is there one that is the worst that you can say without offending anybody directly? When I get questions like this, I'm like, I could give the answer, but I would offend them and start a war, and we don't want to do that. What's the worst kind of general trend that you see, not specific to one person or one group?
Oh, well, in strength and conditioning, I think there might be a certain sort of how do I say this? There might be a certain sort of methodology where people are starting to become very obsessed with looking at things and saying these athletes are successful because of blank.
Yeah.
And it's because of this blank, like let's say something to do with the foot or the way they strike the ground. This is the way they're successful athletes. When you can, just like anything else I'm talking about today, you can't say that an athlete is good or bad because of one thing, or even two things, or even three things.
Yeah.
I think what makes an athlete so great is their ability to do so many things well. So I think it's very easy for people to form tribes and schools of thought over one thing and say this is the holy grail of sports performance. When it's like, no, nothing is. The holy grail is being really good at a lot of different things. Mm-hmm. And there are specialists, but I think it's important that, especially when it comes to human movement and strength and conditioning coaches that are not skill coaches, we can't say there's one thing that's going to make this athlete great. Yeah. So to have this tribe built around the fact that it's this, I completely disagree with that. I think most
100%.
people would, but it's easy to get sucked into that. And it's easy to be attracted to flash and like big words.
Yeah.
But I would just encourage people, like, just do your own research, develop your own thought process, and listen to people that get good results.
Yeah.
If people get good results consistently over a period of time, that person probably has something to offer.
Right. I see so much on social media about like, this person is successful because of this. This person is success, or they find like 5 athletes that do this one thing.
Yes.
And then I could be like, well, these 5 athletes also eat McDonald's. Like, is that the reason why they're good? Yeah. At the end of the day, a lot of times, and this happens with training too, right? Like, these 5 successful people all do this exercise, therefore this exercise is what made them great. Right. The reality is, and this is something that I'm passionate about, all the great athletes that I'm around, I'm always asking them questions all the way back to your earliest memories of sports. And I'm trying to get down to the bottom of like, what actually is the similarities between all these people that made it to the NBA. Yeah. And usually they might do 15 things completely wrong, but they all did 3 things right.
Great point.
And they did those 3 things so well. And a couple of those things maybe they have the genetics, right? They have insane work ethic. They maybe have gone through some sort of struggle throughout their life, which made them kind of elevated them mentally on another level. Yeah. And the list might go on a little bit other than, of course, those little things. But like, all these people are consistently doing these things. And so they can get by with doing the other 15 things wrong. Mm-hmm. I just saw this argument on Brandon Marshall's podcast with Chad Ochocinco. And Chad was like, yelling at them about how you should be eating McDonald's for every meal.
Really?
That's what he did.
Interesting.
And he's like, it built calluses in my body so I could never get hurt. That was his reasoning. After you're watching this podcast, go find that. It's the fun. Maybe I'll do a reaction video to it. It's the funniest conversation. And Brandon Marshall's like, no, there's a science to this. And Chad's like, yeah, but look at me. And that's what the point I'm getting at is, you know, when you have the genetics and you played enough football and you're a dog and you're mentally, like, you're going to make it regardless of what you do. And so you can't just like study these successful athletes and be like, well, they did this, therefore that's correct.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And also, like, I think there's a natural gift that a lot of these athletes that are great possess. And no matter what they do, they're going to be really good at it.
Yeah.
But it's that idea of like hard work beats talent when talent doesn't work hard. It's sort of that, but just as someone who is very interested in mechanics and biomechanics, and that's the lens I take, but that's not the only lens I take. I am very interested in what those athletes do that are biomechanical, but it's very much a common theme across all ground-based sports. Like I made a post the other day about very, very exceptionally talented athletes drop their shin in order to create propulsion. And I'm not saying that's the reason why they're successful. I'm saying that is an outcome of a lot of different biomechanical things happening that's allowing them to produce that force. So let's say I'm going to take off in a sprint from a 3-point start. Better accelerators tend to have that shin drop earlier and also more in terms of the depth of that shin dropping, which allows them to utilize gravity and create a horizontal propulsive force. Whereas if you look at someone like LeBron taking off for a jump, his pin ultimate step, or the step that happens before his last step where he jumps off, that is when his shin drops to create that horizontal force for him to then create an ability for him to get stiff on that front leg, because it's basically like you're shoving yourself forward because you have no choice but to create stiffness on that front leg to jump up.
Yeah.
And you see this with baseball pitchers. You see this with javelin throwers. And I used a bunch of different examples, but I like to say like that is something that is an outcome of a lot of different things happening all at once.
Yeah.
And it's universal with how humans move, because going back to the very start of this podcast, I talked about how despite the fact that I work with baseball players, basketball players, old ladies, young kids, we're all just humans. So it's like a conversation we had earlier. You said there's only so many things the human body can do.
Yeah.
And I think that's a huge point to hit. So appreciate these underlying individual differences, but also understand that we're all still human beings. We're all still the same species. And that is going to influence what we do and what makes us successful in producing force and absorbing force.
Yeah. That's so good. All right, one more speed round question. I got to make this one good. Let's make this one unrelated. Favorite basketball movie of all time? I say that because I'm staring at my two favorites of all time right now, which is, we got the new posters in the studio. He Got Game, White Man Can't Jump. These are the two best for me. Elijah just watched He Got Game, which we had to skip over half the movie because it's not very appropriate for an 11-year-old. But what's the GOAT?
You might kick me out of the studio right now. You know why? I've never seen either of those movies.
No.
I've never seen either. I know.
Oh, dude. Yeah, okay. Our whole itinerary for tomorrow just changed.
Forget the filming.
We're not filming anymore.
We're going to watch these films.
We're going to binge watch these films. No, we literally probably have to watch it after we film tomorrow.
I've seen that dog one.
Oh, no. Air Bud.
I've seen Air Bud. That was pretty good.
Gosh. Elijah likes Air Bud, but he's 11. So.
Yeah, Air Bud's a good movie.
Yeah.
You know what? I think I've seen 10 minutes of White Man Can't Jump, and I really enjoyed it, but I also have just never seen the whole thing.
Dude, He Got Game is like, okay, so first of all, you got Denzel in his acting prime.
Oh, Denzel that?
Yeah.
Oh, man, I'm missing out.
That's in his acting prime. You have Ray Allen, who's not even an actor, in his basketball prime, which, do you remember Ray Allen as a player?
Oh, yeah.
Like stupid athletic.
Incredible.
Shooter, stupid athletic, stupid shifty. He's in it. I don't even know how it was, like, I don't know why he did it, because he wasn't an actor. And his acting's not great in it. But when their basketball scenes are so realistic, because he's really out there hooping, there's a scene where he goes one-on-one with Denzel, and Denzel's his dad in the movie, and he's been in jail, and like they have a bad relationship. They're playing one-on-one with like high stakes, and it turns out that it wasn't acting. They told them, they rolled it out and they're like, literally go at each other.
That's amazing.
And Denzel trained like for years for this.
Of course
like
he
he
did.
was waiting for this.
He's the best.
And then Ray Allen's just cold. And like Denzel comes out and he gets like 4 buckets in a row.
Ooh.
Like tough stuff. He's hitting like inside hand, left hand layups, like banking threes. And then Ray Allen gets pissed and you see it on his face. And I guess in real life he was mad. And so then he started like turning up and dunking on him and stuff. And he ended up winning. But that's for me with basketball movies, it's all about how realistic the basketball scenes are.
Yeah.
There's so many bad. And so, you know, people get mad at me when I say I don't love Hoosiers. That's like the number 1 all-time basketball movie.
Mm-hmm.
The basketball scenes are too unrealistic for me.
You know, I've heard that argument before. I've heard people that know their basketball, they often don't say Hoosiers is their favorite.
Yeah. I don't like, and then have you ever seen The Pistol? Pistol Pete Maravich?
I haven't.
Oh gosh, the best story, the best motivation from any basketball movie ever. Like, you'll start training hard tomorrow on your handles if you watch it. I guarantee you're going to try to be a basketball player again.
We got to watch one of these, man.
Yeah.
We gotta watch
Like
one.
The Pistol is the best motivation, but the basketball scenes are so unrealistic. Like he throws a behind the head pass and it hits him in the forehead, but then he breaks his nose.
That's ridiculous.
Yeah. So Air Bud is your answer.
Air Bud.
Air Bud. Have you seen Coach Carter?
Who was the actor
With,
in that one? I think I saw it when I was really young.
What's his name? Samuel L. Jackson.
I think I have seen that, but I don't remember it because I
Yeah.
was so young.
Yeah.
I'm super uneducated on this.
So we're going
clearly.
Air Bud.
We got to go Air Bud.
Air Bud's the answer.
You're probably never going to get that one again.
I will never.
Someone.
That is unique. That is unique. Awesome, man. Well, I appreciate you doing the podcast. We got a long day of filming tomorrow,
Yes,
so we'll end it here. Where can the people find you?
They can find me on Instagram or Twitter at Conor, like Conor McGregor, CONOR _ and then Harris, HARRIS, and then another underscore after that.
Perfect. And if you're watching YouTube, we'll put it up right here. Definitely go check him out. I mean, for some of the younger athletes, there's some stuff where it's going to be like, I don't know what he's saying, because some of it is really, really in depth. But it's all high quality stuff, especially if you're a coach or if you're looking to get into this field. This is the guy, and he has some good beginner courses and biomechanics courses. So if you're a coach, I would definitely check out Conor, and you guys will be seeing more from him on some of our future programs. All right, guys, we're out.